Okay, good morning everyone. I think it's time to start this event. Let me welcome all of you on behalf of Political Economy Research Group, which is a joint student faculty research group at CEU. And we have various events related to the topic of political economy, mostly focusing on East Central Europe, industrial relations, and several other topics of political economy. And today, the topic of today's event is this book. I will circulate it, but please make sure that I get it back. And we also have the privilege to have the author of the book here, who is Thomas Fetzer. Thomas is an associate professor at the International Relations and European Studies department here at CEU. And before joining CEU in 2009, first of all, he graduated, he earned his PhD at the European University Institute in Florence. And then he held several research positions at the Max Planck Institute, and then at LSE, and also he has a lot of teaching experience in these places, and also at CEU he teaches several courses on economic nationalism, and he is also a very enthusiastic member of the Political Economy Research Group, and currently the faculty chair of this research group. We could also invite, and thanks for accepting our invitation, Magdalena Bernaciak from the European Trade Union Institute in Brussels, currently a researcher there, and she also graduated from CEU, I think last year or already 2 years ago. And her topic also includes labor internationalism and international cooperation amongst trade unions. And we also have the privilege to welcome Guglielmo Meardi from the Industrial Relations Research Unit at the University of Warwick. And they will present the book in 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And then Thomas will react to these comments, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers. And then you are all welcome for a modest reception outside. So thank you very much, and I will give over to Magda or Guglielmo, who wants to start. Magda, please.
Hello, everybody. It's really a great pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank Thomas and Imre and all the organizers for inviting me. It's first time since 2 years that I come to see you, and it's absolutely moving to be here and to be on the other side, which is slightly easier when you comment and you're not commented on. But it's also a great pleasure, given how great the book is, that I will shortly present to you. So thank you very, very much for inviting me. So Thomas's book, maybe I first, for 3 minutes, summarize the main arguments so that we have a kind of base on which we can then comment. So it's basically, it starts with the assertion that since late 1960s, 1970s, the two companies that Thomas focuses on, General Motors and Ford in Europe, the structure of how the operations in Europe were organized underwent quite deep changes. Common managerial structures were created that then interlinked sites located in different countries when it comes to how they are managed. But then also production became linked between countries, so volumes were being distributed between sites, the same models were distributed. They were sourced, parts were sourced from sites which were located in different countries. So this created a certain interconnectedness that then had an impact on trade union strategies of trade unions in the plants in the two countries that Thomas is focused on. So it's Germany and the UK. And the period that he's looking at is quite long. It's almost or actually 70s, 80s, 90s, and till 2000. So it's 30, almost 40 years of trade union history and history of trade union politics in these two companies, in these two countries. And what he discovers is actually that given the transnationalization of both management and production structures in the companies, the results that these changes have on politics of trade unions are sometimes very contradictory and quite paradoxical, and that's what he calls paradoxes of internationalization. He identifies 3 such surprising developments. One of them is that the internationalization of business actually leads to more and more stronger tendency of trade unions to emphasize their national allegiances. So once the companies get more interconnected on the international scale, unions tend to raise the issue of national identity, national autonomy, national unity much more often than it was the case when the sites in different countries were not interconnected. The second paradoxical development is that given that certain practices, due to all the interconnectedness, are getting more and more similar, in certain cases, actually the differences which had existed before the internationalization took place are becoming more and more pronounced. And this, between Germany and UK, very different systems, is very much visible. And then the third paradox that he identifies is the fact that growing interconnectedness creates more and more competitive pressure, but this competition, surprisingly, is also a motor or it's a factor that drives cooperation between unions. Unions that at some points basically cannot already defend their positions from the national arena and go transnational in order to save domestic jobs, but this is the only strategy that they are left with. So paradoxically, competition creates cooperation, but at the same time it limits the extent of cooperation, so this still stays as a kind of defense mechanism for domestic jobs and employment. At the same time, it cannot go into a complete abandon, so you don't abandon your national interests and you still defend your own workers, but then the type of strategy that you apply to do it is different given the circumstances. So these are the 3 most important paradoxes that the book is presenting, and it's a wonderful volume to read, I would say. So I had really hard time trying to identify things that I could pick on, and read it I think 3 times through, and then try to think what I can say. So I first start with 2 points of praise, because this I really have to do. So given Thomas's background in history, it's a really nice interconnected volume that links the 2 disciplines that not always go together. So from history, Thomas, I think, took the attention to detail. It's very detailed, very carefully researched volume, also with a kind of different way of presenting data to what we are used to normally in political science. So it's lots of anecdotes, very little facts, but it's really such a great thing to read, and it's a bit like a novel at some points because of this, but then it's really high quality information, so it's lots of work, and we have to remember that he reconstructs events from 1960s, 70s, 80s, when internet didn't exist, and you have to really go to archives and dig deep to find things. So amazing work in this respect. From political science, then, I think he took the importance that he attaches to trying to outline the mechanisms. So why is this cooperation taking place? To what extent, what factors drive it, and I think this is also very nice. On one hand, you have very detailed information, but then there is also mechanisms and variables, and this makes it then more closer to what political science volumes are normally about. And I think the main advantage of this mix is what he acknowledges himself in the conclusion, is basically that we put what is happening currently at the companies, and not only at these two companies, but in the sector as a whole, into a longer time perspective. And we realize suddenly that, you know, the pressures and the competitive character of relations between the plants has been there for the 40 years already. And also the dilemmas related to, you know, whether to try national strategies, what kind of strategies are there to keep the workplaces there. This is not as new as we might think, going 5 years back in the EBSCO search or in JSTOR and seeing the articles only from that time. So I think this is really very useful to realize and see then that it's a part of a longer continuity, what is happening at the plants. And the other point which I find very good is the way Thomas goes further with the concepts, I would say. So on one hand, very often what is expected in the literature, and it's a slightly optimistic and a slightly normatively driven view, I would say, is that, you know, there will be, with the growing internationalization, there will be more and more international links, and the national identities will kind of fade. And Thomas says, well, to put this like a dichotomy, or to put this development as a linear tendency, might be quite misleading. These two notions, national and transnational or international, coexist, and sometimes actually, as he phrased it in the first paradox, more international might actually mean that the national becomes also more important for the actors. So I found this contestation of the dichotomy very, very interesting. And the second very great contribution, I would say, also being the person who dealt with the transnational union cooperation, is the concept under a very catchy label of risk community, or this is basically the idea that, as I already mentioned, plants which are interconnected face similar threats related to dismissals, to downsizing, and then they are in a way interconnected with this shared risk perception, and this is the driver of cooperation. And I think this is very nicely both called, because then you can just refer to this phrase as a Fetzer's concept, but I think it really captures a mechanism which is complex to otherwise explain, but he made it really well. If I was really to try to be picky, and it's really difficult to, as I said, find things on which I could pick, one of them is perhaps, given the novelty of the concepts and that he's using, he's also referring, which I didn't mention, to the notion of economic nationalism, and this is basically what he describes under the national dimension of trade union politics. Given the novelty of the concept, I was sometimes slightly not sure exactly where the labels or parts of the concepts come from. So, for instance, when you refer to economic nationalism, you say, yeah, so elements of this is identity, autonomy, unity, but how exactly you pick these three? So is it more from the data that you found, or is it already somewhere in the literature? And sometimes I was a bit not sure, for instance, whether then the phenomena which were analyzed under the labels, whether they are not too broad and too diverse. So there is, for instance, this idea of national autonomy, and this means very different things for the German unions and for the British. No, the Germans are more into national autonomy as the autonomy of their production structures from the European management, and in UK it's more the autonomy of the government to be able to enforce on investors local content and so on. So I was not sure whether these two can be put under one conceptual umbrella, but I think it's really already a great job to push this concept forward and to put it so it's really a small issue. And then once I was also thinking, it's a great variety of different politics and interests already, given that we have two sides in two countries, so we have 2 by 2 dimension already here. But then I was also thinking whether already even here, this concept really covers what is going on in the countries. And this, I had this thought when I read, and also from my own research about the Eisenach plant, which is the East German Opel site, and whether this really, given the lean character of the site and lower wages there, whether, for instance, this fits already into the German discourse that was presented in the book, the German unity, German identity. So to what extent these sites which are slightly different or cheaper, how do they fit the picture? And even more, if it's not perhaps this most important sites in the country that drive the economic nationalism concept as it is reconstructed in the book. So Rüsselsheim, perhaps Bochum to a certain extent in the GM case. So whose concept is this really, or whose rhetorics is really this nationalist rhetorics, whether there are some differences between sites within the countries, no? And the very same thing would also apply to what Thomas refers as European patriotism. So the idea that certain elements of this nationalist rhetoric can be put on a higher level and used by plants from different countries vis-a-vis locations in Asia or in east of Europe, and then create again a kind of us versus them rhetorics, whether what is the position of the peripheral regions in Europe. So at the time of where the book, the time frame that the book covers, Spain is already 20 years in the picture. So, and then, you know, again, so what decides really that you become a part of European discourse, or when are you covered under this? And then, yeah, who decides it really, and who pushes then this rhetorics really? So these are the core sides, or who puts you in the group, or who decides that you are out of the European spectrum? And I don't know whether I'm not talking too long, but I have 3 reflections still, because it's so these were the only points that I could think were kind of to develop further. And then also I had a couple of, I mean, many ideas when I was reading it. It's really very thought-provoking. So one of my questions would be about the notion of competition as a driver of cooperation, whether the relation is not a bit like Russian P-shaped or N-shaped. So if you don't have competition, you don't cooperate, then you cooperate, but when it becomes so severe that you start fighting for the very survival, perhaps the side that it also tilts, and you have less and less, unions are less inclined to do things together. And I was thinking about it in relation to one of the cases in my dissertation, MAN, where basically the Germans did everything desperately to keep their site open, and then this cooperation with all the caveats and fragility that it has might not be the optimal solution already, because the stakes are too high, becoming too high. Then I was also thinking how this very plant-focused picture, how it would be very nice, and of course I think already beyond the focus of the book, because the book really focuses on trade union politics at the plant level with some occasional, how the state politics enters the picture, and how very interestingly it can really change the stakes of the game, the risk perceptions. So it's not only about the regulatory frame that it creates, but the government directly intervening into the company affairs, as it was during the crisis and the Magna and General Motors, when the German government suddenly became more willing to save the locations, and how this influences the plant level politics of this kind. And I was also thinking, Thomas is slightly skeptical, or perhaps a bit cautious with trying to think about the generalizability of the concept. But I think in certain ways you can say things already about our. I think it's becoming clear why then there is not so much going on between North and South. I mean, in both, in a sense of developing world and developed world, because you don't have the competition is not there. They're usually producing goods which are compatible and not really. It's not, you know, the element of interconnectedness and competition is not that strong, I would say. And then East-West setting, I would say, then the risk perhaps is not as symmetric as it is in the Western case. So that would be perhaps a bit of my interpretation of the East-West story. Then you need some extra incentives or benefits in order to spur cooperation. So I think, and then you have also different industrial relations systems. So if I can imagine, Scandinavians might not be so much worried about Saab being sold to somebody else, because they, in the first place, are even they are more into accepting active labor market policy, and not so much about protecting jobs at any cost. And they are also not so much enthusiastic about European or international union cooperation. So I think it's really a very interesting ways to think in which context how the risk perception story can, in which context this might work, in which this not, and what mechanisms come in place there. But yeah, it's just really an extension. But so it's a great read, I think, and the connection between history, detail, and political science mechanism kind of approach, it's really great. So I read it with open mouth. Thanks so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Magda. And I would like to give it over to Guglielmo.
I'm going to talk about the same book. And the book is about the relations between the German and the British. And here I have to represent the British. I'm not really typical, but I will try. Now, as Magda already has said, the book is extremely interesting, and it's very, very strong methodologically and conceptually. And it makes three big arguments which are relevant not only for historians of Ford and General Motors, who may be a rather small public, but they make a strong contribution to the understanding of European history, labor history, institutions, institutional development, transnational, international business, globalization, transnationalization, the ideas of nationalism, cultural history, and so on. So I think that it would be quite a lot of people who should read this book. Just to summarize again, because it helps repeating and trying to be as clear as possible, the book is very clear. There are three big arguments in three big chapters, quite long chapters. The first one is about Europeanization. They're all about the paradoxes of internationalization. The first says that Europeanization didn't lead to the disappearance of national identity, rather the opposite, which makes sense. It fits in a way with many of the debates about globalization, whereby because of globalization, locations become more important, not less important, because you have more links with other people, you have to find what you have different to offer in comparison to other people. But it's quite interesting when applied to labor and unions becoming more aware of the national identities when they get in touch, when they discover the others in other places, in other settings. The second one is about convergence, divergence, and it moves the debate a bit further with much more subtlety than much of the debate on convergence and divergence of institutions, when saying that internationalization leads to some convergence in institutions, in particular between these two countries. Britain adopts more legal regulations than in the past. In this sense, it becomes a bit more German. On the other side, German decentralizes industrial relations and becomes a little bit more British. However, behind this apparent similarity, which are relatively superficial in the institutions, the working of the institution is recreated all the time. There's a lot of recreation in this book. And therefore, the institutions are not really abandoned, but they are made working in ways which fit with competitive advantages of each country. And therefore, the Germans still keep very distinctive German ways of doing certain things and the British other ones. And third point is about competition and transnationalization of labor. Already Magda has said something because she's an expert of that as well, as far as I remember, for a discussion 2 years ago, which you may remember we had here. Transnationalization leads, transnational competition leads to more transnational labor activity because labor solidarity is a response to competition. So competition doesn't decrease solidarity, it increases solidarity because it makes it much more necessary. However, because the solidarity, the transnational action is all based on an interest calculation, on trying to defend what you have, it's always contingent, very limited in a way, and this fits, I think, quite well with Magda's interpretation. So these three contributions are all very important. How transnationalism doesn't lead to a world which is flat, as many economists say, and everything is the same, and homogenization and so on. I'm not a historian, and I'm not an expert of Ford and General Motors myself. But I did try hard to find something wrong in the book, because when you are given a role of reviewing a book or discussing it, you have to show that actually you read it. And the way to do it is to say, well, page 89, this story is wrong. And I really did my best. I went out of the way to find more information, but I could hardly find anything. I even made the effort to have a very long phone call with my father-in-law. What does my father-in-law have to do with that? My father-in-law worked at Ford for exactly this period in Dagenham. So it's this book. I said, look, Alex, they wrote a book about you. Okay, and I went through the book asking whether it was true what was there, and he confirmed everything you said. So it is even confirmed. I should have sent him here rather than. But he stressed, he had my father-in-law added a couple of details, but it is true that the evolution of the international links between the British and the German plants evolved at Ford, evolved in that way. There were very strong relations, so that is a big contribution of the book. It's the easiest thing to notice how important internationalization was already 40 years ago. It's not something which they invented the last year. There were already in the 73 flights a day between his factory and the one in Cologne, always full of people going up and down between Cologne and Essex. It confirmed that until the 80s, really, the competition was more about words. It was not really a big problem. It was not affecting the fear of jobs that much. It was going relatively well. And from the 80s, because of the decline of manufacturing in the UK, the tension became bigger. It confirms that when the headquarters of Fords of Europe were moved from Britain to Germany in 1997, it was a disappointment, of course, for the British workers, but it had been in the making for quite a long time. And also the rhetorics used by the British trade unions was exactly the one Thomas described very well, based on the British history and the British tradition, contesting always the headquarters point of view that British workers were less efficient than the German ones, especially because they take too many tea breaks. Tea breaks, if you want to study British industrial relation, you have to know about tea breaks. They come up all the time in construction, in manufacturing, and so on. Tea breaks are the big issue. I don't like tea, but I have to know about tea breaks. And that was the debate, but the British trade unions always had their counter arguments. Now the problem is not the tea breaks, the problem is our machinery come from the 50s, the German ones have the one from the 70s and 80s, so of course they need less maintenance and the machines work longer. It is the machines that take the tea breaks because they're too old. It's not the workers, the workers who take the tea breaks. So that is, so the book is all confirmed, and it's also relevant. I mean, it is on a good topic. Let's face it, British-German relations. I mean, what a better topic. I mean, Polish-German relations are nearly that interesting, but the British-German ones are very good, very good too. There is a book which has just come out in Britain, which is by German journalist working in the UK, Ostermann. And the book, the title is Keeping Up with the Germans. And it's 2 centuries of British-German encounters. It's a shame that the book by Thomas came a little bit too late, because really it would have fitted, it would have provided so much good material for that book, which is exactly about how the 2 identities change all the time. And obviously there is a chapter about cars and the car industry, but it's not as sophisticated, obviously, as the one by Thomas. But it's a similar thing. That book, Keeping Up with Germans, it tells about a meeting between Helmut Kohl and Margaret Thatcher in the 80s. And Helmut Kohl invited Margaret Thatcher to Germany, and he really went out of his way, made all his effort to show another face of Germany, to show that Germany was European, was open, was nothing to worry about, it was nothing militaristic, so there was no soldier or no policeman to be even seen. He showed all the French influences, all the international connections, all the cosmopolitanism, all the friendliness, the poetry, and so on. And as soon as the meeting stopped, Margaret Thatcher turned to her aide, and the first thing she said, "That man is so German." So it didn't work at all, because the strong perception, whatever actually you do, and this is the strength of the book by Thomas, you never find actually the word, it's a book about nationalism, where the word nation never appears. Okay, so nations don't exist, but nationalism exists. So people perceive nations, even if nations don't exist. So Kohl can make all his best to play the European and hide everything which is German, but still Margaret Thatcher will say how German it is. And the same happens here, not because British and German trade unions are always British and always German, but because they are perceived, the British trade unions will always be perceived by the Germans as British and the German ones the other way around, even if they change. And this, I think, is historically probably the very interesting point, how the ways national resources and national rhetorics are used has changed dramatically from the 70s to the 80s. And that has changed because of structural reasons. So this is a book about, in a way, national culture and rhetorics, but it fits very well with, it doesn't use culture as an opposite concept to structural factors. It actually integrates them very well. So in the 70s, the national rhetoric was all based on strengths, because that was the period where everywhere in Europe, workers' power was increasing, and Thomas also quotes Silva to us as a basis for that. So the British were saying, actually, our trade unions are the best, they are real trade unions, not the Germans who sell out because they spend too much time in the works councils. We are the real trade unions, we are able to negotiate, we should never become as weak as the Germans. And the Germans obviously would say the opposite. We are the ones who can sign collective agreements which have some legal validity, instead of the British who have to go on strike every minute to confirm the validity of the agreement. But that was still based on the strength. So each of them were actually defending their institution as the best and seeing the other side as worse. With the 80s, when everywhere in Europe, especially in Britain, but in a way this is a structural phenomenon in the economy, the power of labor declines in comparison to that of capital, then immediately, especially the British, but to some extent also the Germans, they use the comparison in the opposite way. So the British start comparing themselves to the Germans, say, well, but the Germans have a better situation. Why are we treated worse? So it becomes a bargaining tool with local management rather than a way to affirm that we are right and we are doing things in the correct ways. It's a very detailed historical book, and in books like this one, sometimes it is the details which are really the most striking points. I will mention only a couple of them. First, Thomas knows very well his topic and his area, and he has done his research, but he also knows the literature terribly well on both sides. And therefore he can allow himself to notice national lenses, not only in the responses and documents of trade unionists, but also in the literature. So he finds out how sometimes the German literature uses stereotypes about British industrial relation and vice versa, like Sassoon on Germany, say, you know, at page 19, you have a fantastic quote. You say, well, this is so exaggerate, you know, this German view of, this British view of Germany. It shows how things, already Magda has commented on that, have developed much earlier than we now think, because we don't have much historical memory. That is, Ford started to use investment choices as a bargaining tool already in 1971. It's not something which they started to do a couple of years ago because of globalization. It shows how in 1965, it was quite interesting, it was IG Metall who had refused internationalization of employee representation globally as an American strategy to control Europe. And it's quite interesting because then, in a way, it became a little bit the other way around. But so we forget that there had been a wave of labor transnationalism in the late 60s, beginning of the 70s. It's quite interesting. IG Metall at the time was against it, defending, because it saw as a risk for the independence of German collective bargaining. All the conceptual use of nationalism, already Magda has commented on it. I found it quite convincing, this idea of identity, autonomy, and unity. All three are full of details. And theoretically as well, Thomas criticized Wolfgang Streeck idea that there is some sort of competitive nationalism or national solidarity that develops because of Europeanization. Says, well, not really, because it is true there is a use of national rhetoric, but that doesn't mean there is national solidarity. This is union national economic nationalism. So it's a way to pursue union goals. Again, this is a book about nationalism which never mentions the nation. So you can be a union nationalist without actually subscribing to a completely unitary idea of the nation. So I think the book is very, very strong. Instead of making criticism and so on, I would try to ask Thomas, how can you use this book on some broader debates? The first one is whether you can draw any general lessons about how union transnationalism and solidarity can increase. Because clearly here there is an effect of competition increasing the scope and the need for coordination. However, there isn't very much about collective bargaining, which is, I think, much more important now, the comparison and coordination of collective bargaining, than it was in the 70s and 80s. You show how the comparison actually started in the 80s. Is there some sort of critical mass of meetings and collective bargaining rounds that you need until you discover you are in a sort of risk community? You show very well that meetings themselves are not enough. And there is some other research. I'm more of a sociologist rather than a historian. Colleagues in Saarbrücken studied the European Works Council meetings with ethnographic tools rather, and they show how people sit at the meeting. All the French, they sit on one side, and they have all these fantastic charts of where people sit, and the French sit on one side, the Germans sit on the other side. Every now and then you see there is a French sitting in the middle of the Germans, but there is a note, well, this guy arrived late. So arrived late, it was only one place free. And no Germans actually arrives late. It was quite interesting. So there are all these, a meeting is not enough to create solidarity and merge identities. But certainly the idea that you can achieve more by coordinating your strategy, according to a sort of prisoner dilemma, it requires the iteration of bargaining rounds. You need to lose a couple of times by going alone to discover that actually coordinating with the Germans or with the British is a second best choice, but it's one that can offer a better result. But how long does it take? The second one is you talk about convergence, but here about Germany, there is a much broader debate about the institutional change of Germany. And for instance, you quote Wolfgang Streeck, of course, and you try to use dynamic theories of how institutions change. But Wolfgang Streeck says that really Germany has changed completely and the German model doesn't exist. And because of financial liberalization and decentralization, that is basically nothing of what the German model was in the first place. This is what he wrote in 2009. I think he already changed his mind again. But that is a point you discuss, you present the literature, but you never really say whether you agree or not about, you said there has been some convergence, but that immediately move to the fact that actually within this apparent convergence, still the Germans, they use their tools like co-determination very much for competitive reasons. And finally, well, in a way Magda already mentioned that, how can you, what can we learn from this book about the use of economic nationalist ideas and the perception of difference in a transnational union context when looking at Germany now and German trade unions now? When there are a lot of debates at different levels. At the sector level, in the mining industry, they are criticized for defending coal production still, well, the chemical and mining trade union, against the idea that there should be a European target of reducing emissions. In the chemical sector, the same, that is the defend the chemical industry against regulation, environmental regulation, and especially on wages. If we talk about social dumping, which is something Magda is more of an expert than I am, while the fall of unit labor costs in Germany, which is now criticized by everybody in Europe, and trade unions are often associated to that. Why the trade unions in Germany didn't play by the rules by defending their wages in relation to productivity in the last 10, 20 years. I think in comparison to this, probably because German-British relations are quite specific. Although there is a clearly rising anti-German feeling across Europe, especially Southern Europe, at the union level that is not particularly visible. But do you think that can be on these issues, especially wages, but also the other ones, the risk of an anti-German union reactions and an isolation of German unions in the European debates?
Thank you very much, Magda and Guglielmo, for these very fascinating contributions. And now I would like to ask Thomas to either pick up a few points or just talk in general about the background of the book, so whichever you prefer. But you can stay if you would like.
Oh.
So, well, first of all, thank you so much. There was too much praise, I think, and if I can start with the praise, then it's just that one aspect Magda mentioned just reminded me of this one of the most torturing, probably, or most kind of difficult moments in the too long process of writing this book, which was because you highlighted this, that there's this kind of historical stuff and the details and all this, and then there's the political science, mechanisms and all. And I just remember when I submitted a working paper, which was a first attempt to actually put all my nice details into some kind of framework, and I submitted it to the Max Planck Institute working paper series in Cologne, and I still very vividly remember getting the reviews back, and it was just shattering, essentially saying that this is just a heap of details with no framework whatsoever, and this is when it sort of dawned on me that either I just try to make it into some more bring it into some more rigid and, in a way, social science framework, or else do something different. So thanks a lot for the praise, and I guess I will spare you the anecdotes about how many archives I went to and how I had to read the documents with kind of some hidden protection because I wasn't allowed to look at certain things, and obviously I still kind of put them from the shelf. But anyway, so I will just try to pick up a few things that were mentioned again, like in a way too friendly manner, but. The general issue is first to say that a number of shortcomings have been already mentioned, and as I read it yesterday again, I realized that, for example, one of the major shortcomings is that it is a German and British story, but as it's so much connected to the broader internationalization of these firms, more should have been said about the major other locations, especially Spain, and then also and Belgium, and also the Central East European locations after 1990. So and there's always something hanging there, which you have these two players that are kind of looked at, and then you never really know what's going on with the others. So that's one shortcoming that I saw as I wrote it already. The other shortcoming, which you made me aware of, is the issue of that I haven't apparently managed to try what I actually tried hardest was to say, like, that there's some debates, and so this is mostly kind of a book written for labor studies scholars and people in labor history and labor in industrial relations, and to try to say, well, there are certain things that have been discussed, and maybe I can bring in some kind of outside literatures to shed some new light on some of these controversies. And something that you said about, especially about the literature on nationalism, economic nationalism, is I think very pertinent. Because also, again, I read it yesterday, and it's just exceedingly short. The introduction that I have there into this literature. It used to be longer, and I cut it when in the editing process. But it's just too short to actually make this claim in a way more convincingly to say that where do I take this from? I mean, I do mention that it comes from a very influential nationalism studies definition by A.D. Smith, but it should have been much more extensive in a discussion of different concepts of nationalism. Why do I go for this one rather than another, and so on. So this is in the same way as I still regret, we don't really have so many IR people here, but I still regret that I kind of mention in passing that I use or try to use regime theory in terms of the cooperation initiatives to see like how that can be connected, like this cooperation competition paradox, and that is obviously in some way analogous to IR regime theory, but I never really figured out how to do that systematically, so it's something again that is a shortcoming. Now, just maybe 2 or 3 quick points in response to what was said. Probably the most important issue that both of you mentioned, or that both of you highlight in different ways, is the question of generalizability. And we had also in PERG some discussion about that when I presented earlier. Again, I totally agree. Like, this is a single case study, and we had a very encompassing lecture yesterday by Guglielmo that covered how many countries? 10, 15, something like that, and some macro processes of various sorts. And so I have a lot of admiration for that, and in some sense I kind of feel that this is my tiny case study doesn't really kind of match up with that, and certainly it's true that, and I kind of briefly mentioned it in the conclusions, that generalizability is very limited here, because we know that, as Guglielmo also said, sectoral differences are important, and not every sector is as prone to these national identity projections as the car industry. Not every sector, not every company structure is as conducive to cross-border cooperation and so on. What I can say in defense is just that One thing is that I do think that what I sort of portray as these three paradoxes are not totally random. So they are researched across 2 countries and 2 cases. So I feel relatively convinced or confident that these could be actually useful to explore also at a broader level. And what I sometimes feel also, what I do think is an advantage of case study research. You know, I mean, Carlo Ginzburg wrote a book about one Miller, and that has told us a lot of things about 16th century society, probably perhaps at least as much as a lot of macro studies. So the issue is not so much like what is in a way the unit of analysis, but whether there can be some heuristic insight can be gained, and so this is in a way how I justify this whole approach, is that in a way it helps to test some of the things, and maybe question some of the assumptions that have been around for quite some time, and that maybe should be revised or could be explored more in detail. So my favorite example is this sort of very macro literature, survey literature on labor practices in American-owned firms, where nowadays you have this sort of general assumption and conclusion that, yeah, what they really don't like is German labor relations, and it's really bad, and you know, all this co-determination stuff, and it's inhibiting, and they don't like it, and they want to get rid of it, and all. And you know, if you look at the more in a historical perspective, you of course see that this is in a way recent, and you know, in the 60s they were very happy with well, they were never happy about co-determination. Let's say they were, well, that would be going too far, but in relative terms they were of course much happier with what they found in the Federal Republic than what they found in the UK. So that's sort of something where I think a case study can have some heuristic insight, and in the same way it opens up in a way possibly new questions, new perspectives, and I try to, in a way, say, and Magda also mentioned that some of these things, like the typology of national allegiances, but also this idea of the risk community when it comes to cooperation initiatives, in a way, could be possibly extended at a more large N case study research design, which you know, you could combine it because of different risk profiles of companies and just test it to see like if that holds what I'm saying. I'm not. Yeah. So case study in a way has its functions that I could just say in my defense. Now, apart from that. I think there are a couple more things that I need to think about more when it comes to this question of the convergence and path dependence, and also what Magda said about the possibility to think about, or whether the economic nationalism, where does it come from? How can we connect that to agency? Just a small point about Eisenach. This is, I find one of the ironic issues, of course, is there also that you get these kind of fractures of national unity, and that national unity is not only something that is celebrated, but that is also questioned, so to speak, and that it's equally an issue when it's questioned. That also underlines its importance. And in that particular case of this new Opel plant in Eisenach, it's just a fracturing of national unity, because there's this new East-West dimension, which, so to speak, adds or undermines the kind of German versus the others dimension as they start, or for at least for a certain period of time, there is a West versus East German issue. Interestingly, in fact, in a slightly similar way as in the Ford case, you have one where this new Scottish plant comes into the picture, where you also have a fracturing of the UK unity. I'm sure I didn't really respond to very many of your points, but I hope we can continue later.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Now, if you have any questions or comments related to either the book or the contributions you just heard, just please feel free to ask. but you are also welcome to approach the author and the commentators outside during the reception. So, please.